Good morning. We'll call the meeting to order. We're here this morning to continue our posture hearings in preparation for the 2021 NDAA. And this morning we will hear from the Department of the Air Force and the Space Force Command on the budget request for their departments, the President's budget request from FY21. We are joined by the Honorable Barrett, Secretary of the Air Force, and it is her first time before our committee. So welcome. And look forward to your testimony. General David Goldfein, who's the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and in all likelihood, this may well be your last time before the committee. So the beginnings and the endings, and we certainly appreciate your service and also your consistent candor before this committee and in working with us so well over your time as the Chief of Staff. We appreciate that leadership. And we are joined by General John Raymond, Chief of Space Operations for the U.S. Space Force. Not only is this his first time before the committee, but it is the first time having a representative from the U.S. Space Force and the newly created U.S. Space Force. So we're very anxious to hear from you about how the setup of that is going. I thank our witnesses for being here, and I think that the challenge going forward, which we've talked about a lot in this committee, is, as always happens with arms, so you're consistently asked to do more than you have the resources to do. And how you manage that, I think, is the great challenge at the Pentagon right now in terms of, how do we figure out maybe to get more resources? How do we figure out to perhaps change what the strategy is to better match those resources? But in doing that, there is considerable risk in terms of how we make sure that we're prepared for what it is that we do choose to do. And I was particularly interested in the study that you did, I think came out that said you have roughly 319 squadrons and you'd like to have 386. And the trouble with that is you are highly unlikely to get 386. So I worry about what that means in terms of what our actual plan is and our ability to execute it. If we set up and say, well, we have to have this much and we don't, then we're sort of scrambling around, unable to truly be prepared for any mission, since we're trying to prepare for more missions than we can possibly do, if that makes sense. I'd like to know how we rationalize that. And also something that has come up consistently is, so that's how many squadrons you want. But just with our discussion of ships and this mythical number of ships that at some point in the future we're going to have, the truly important thing is how many of our squadrons, or ships for that matter, are operational. And that seems to have been a major challenge. We get consistent reports about, pick an airframe. There we have, 110 of them, but on any given day, only 60 of them are ready to go. Is there a way to improve that? And what are you focused on to make sure that if we have the actual piece of equipment, that it works? Because that is a frustrating misuse of resources if you have something and you can't get it to do what it is supposed to do. Along those lines, one of the ways that we've tried to rationalize the irrational situation I just described is by relying excessively on the OCO. One of my all-time favorite things was the phrase they came up with last year where they actually eliminated the subterfuge and came up with something that they called FOCO. Fake OCO, just being very honest about it. We want this money. We don't want to put it on the budget because we, have budget caps to deal with. So we're going to call it emergency funding so it can be, quote, off budget, unquote. And the Air Force relies quite a bit on that. I forget the statistics off the top of my head. I think it's like $21.6 billion in OCO for the Air Force. And the estimates were, I think less than $2 billion that was for actual overseas contingency operations. So, how you plan to not rely on that long term is enormously important. And tied into all of this, as a number of members I'm sure will raise, is the bitter irony that we also get your unfunded requirements list, while at the same time we just had the $3.8 billion reprogramming, where money, for instance, was taken out of the F-35 program to go to the wall, which, as Ms. Davis helpfully pointed out in an earlier hearing, is not in the National Defense Strategy at all. We are supposed to build the Pentagon budget and our strategy based on the National Defense Strategy. It doesn't say anything in there about money for a southern border wall, and yet we're going to take the money out of our programs, put it in there, and then come back to us and say, oh, it's an unfunded requirement. It's like, no, it was funded. You took the money and spent it someplace else. That is an enormous problem, and it is causing problems at the Department of Defense, and we should not simply let that go by. And then there is the Space Force. And I will tell you, I I've always been fairly ambivalent about that. At the end of the day, I trusted Mr. Rogers and Mr. Cooper as the two chairs of the committee that created it. And I also trust the fundamental idea behind it, and that is that space is central to everything we do. It is the center of our command and control structure that it makes almost everything we do within the military operate. It deserved to have a special segment to make sure that we are training the people who work in that arena properly and for that mission. And I get that, and I understand that, and I think it is a reasonable thing to do. The concern is it just another bureaucracy? Do we get a better, more focused look at how we take care of our space needs within national defense? Or do we get a bunch more generals, a lot more staff doing basically the same thing? And I think, General Raymond, that is your great challenge, is to make sure that it works in an efficient and effective way and isn't just another bureaucracy. And with that, I will yield to the ranking member, Mr. Thornberry, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me join in welcoming each of our witnesses today. And if this should be General Goldfein's last appearance before the committee, I also want to thank him and Don for both of your service to the country over a long period. It has been exceptional, and not just in your current position. And we are very grateful for all that both of you have done. There's no question this is a challenging time for the Air Force, not just because much of what we talk about when we say great power competition falls on y'all's shoulders, but also because there's this internal change going on at the same time. Now, we've dealt with such situations before, such as the end of World War II, and came out pretty well. But it is a challenging time for each of you. And like we talked about a bit last week with the Navy, I think what's most helpful is if we can have a, not necessarily every detail laid out, but a plan, an approach going forward. Now, that's particularly true when it comes to space, because you're a new organization. We're all beginning to think of space in different ways as a warfighting domain, and we need that sort of vision about where we ought to go. But it's also true with the Air Force. The controversy over the last week was somebody saying we don't need any manned fighters anymore, and technology is changing. Adversaries are changing, and so this vision of where we move forward, to me, is just as important as this particular year's budget request. They need, obviously, to go together, but as I say, there's a lot on y'all's plates, but I have full confidence in your ability to deal with it. Thanks for being here. I yield back.
Thank you. Secretary Barrett, or I'm assuming you're going first. Go ahead.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, members of the committee, thank you for inviting us to appear before you today. I'm especially privileged to be joined by two exemplary chiefs, Chief Goldfein on what may be his last appearance before this committee as the Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force, and the exemplary Chief J. Raymond, who is the Chief of Space Operations and leading that in its stand-up. The international security environment changes unpredictably. China and Russia challenge American capabilities with new technologies and systems. Iran and North Korea threaten regional and global stability, while violent extremism remains a global menace. The National Defense Strategy calls on the Department of the Air Force as a critical component of the joint force to deter, and if deterrence fails, to defeat these threats. This fiscal year's, the 2021 budget request sets the course for the department to accomplish these aims. Specifically, the Department of the Air Force invests in future forces that allow us to connect the joint force, dominate space, generate combat power, and conduct logistics under attack. We will continue to present ready forces to combatant commanders as we defend the homeland, build strategic deterrence, and counter violent extremism. Finally, we will strengthen the foundation of our forces, our airmen and space professionals, as we develop and care for our people and their families. This budget submission shifts force design to create irreversible momentum toward achieving the mission of the National Defense Strategy while growing strong and resilient leaders and families. The top policy priority for the Department is the successful launch of the United States Space Force. The space domain is integral to the joint team's success, not just in space, but in all warfighting domains. The Department of the Air Force supports a lean, agile Space Force to preserve access to space for America and our allies while deterring and, if necessary, defeating malicious actors. The success of the United States Space Force will be measured by how well we protect freedom of access to, through, and from space. In space and air, our most important investment is in connecting the joint force. We are developing the technologies to connect every sensor, every shooter, and every echelon of command to enable seamless, joint, all-domain operations. This battle network is essential to defeating current and future threats. We are also directing pivotal resources to recruit and retain the best people our nation has to offer. We are an inclusive and diverse force and are modernizing our promotion system while investing in the professional development of airmen and space professionals. The Department is expanding ongoing efforts to support and care for families. We are tackling privatized housing and PFAS challenges. Along with our sister services, we encourage state reciprocity for occupational licensing for spouses and quality schools for our children. And we are investing in professionally designed and advised programs to reduce suicides and sexual assaults. To fund future air and space forces that are capable of defending the nation against a peer competitor, we must divest some aging legacy systems. This budget retires limited numbers of aircraft, consolidating resources to increase readiness in remaining aircraft, and invest in recapitalization and modernization. This includes investing in GPS-3 satellites with signals that are 3 times more accurate and up to 8 times more anti-jam resilient than previous generations. We thank this committee and the entire Congress for fully funding the recovery efforts to rebuild Tyndall and Offutt Air Force bases. We will seek additional support as our installations and personnel assist with the ongoing COVID-19 quarantine. Ladies and gentlemen, with your continued support, America's air and space forces stand ready. We look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General Goldfein.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, distinguished members of the committee. It's an honor to present my last budget submission for the first time with both Secretary Barbara Barrett, the 25th Secretary of the Air Force, and General J. Raymond, the first Chief of Space Operations. These are indeed historic times. So I will defer all discussion on space matters to Chief Raymond, but I want you to know it is my top priority to make him and his new service successful. So my bottom line up front, this budget, building on the last 3, offers the most aggressive package of strategic trades we have made as a department in over 2 decades to achieve complete alignment with the National Defense Strategy and secure our nation's military superiority for the next decade. Secretary Esper's guidance for this budget build was crystal clear. Build an Air Force and a Space Force that can compete, deter, and win shoulder to shoulder with our joint teammates and our allies and partners against a nuclear peer in an era of great power competition. This budget is designed to achieve this objective, and we're asking for your support to make the tough but necessary trades we'll discuss today. In numerous war games against our best assessment of the threat in 2030 and beyond, as Secretary Barrett stated, we found that investment in 4 key areas provided the Air Force we need to prevail. First, this budget connects the joint force in ways we are not today connected in order to truly fight as a joint team. Under the leadership of our chairman, General Mark Milley, the Joint Chiefs and combatant commanders are fully engaged in developing a new doctrine of warfare called Joint All-Domain Operations. Under this new warfighting construct, the Air Force is the designated lead service to connect platforms, sensors, and weapons from all domains, all services, and our allies and partners so we can truly operate at the speed of relevance. We call it Joint All-Domain Command and Control, or JADC2 for short. And we're moving out quickly. Every 4 months, we host a demonstration and link joint capabilities that are not currently connected to advance joint all-domain operations to the next level. I look forward to describing what we've achieved to date and where we're headed during questioning. Second, we must dominate space. Chief Raymond will cover investments in this critical domain of operations. And our third area of focus is generating combat power, beginning with our nuclear enterprise. This budget moves us forward to recapitalize our two legs of the triad and the critical nuclear command and control that ties it all together. Fourth, this budget invests in a new way of approaching how we keep our joint team deployed and sustained in contested combat environments. We must assume our logistics enterprise will be under attack. But the foundation of this budget submission is the greatest treasure in our nation's arsenal, our airmen, and those who will join the Space Force. We look forward to working with this committee to ensure we keep faith with the airmen that will defend our nation and support their families entrusted to our care. As this committee is aware, the 21 top line is relatively flat from last year, well short of the 3 to 5% growth required to properly support the NDS. In a flat budget environment, if a service is to move forward, it must do two things. It must make better use of what it has by connecting all platforms, sensors, and weapons in a battlefield network, JADC2. And it must find internal savings to pay for new capabilities. So Chief Raymond and I held our own night court and identified $21 billion across the FYDP by retiring the oldest of our legacy weapon systems that are either not survivable or do not contribute significantly to the 2030 peer fight. Not one of these trades is easy. Every weapon system we are asking to retire has performed well in the current fight, but many are at the end of their service life and have no future in a nuclear peer fight. This is today's hard reality. Not surprisingly, of the services, the Air and Space Forces have the largest classified portfolio of investment. This makes the story harder to tell, since most of what we're retiring is unclassified and visible, while many of our game-changing investments are classified and therefore invisible. And we want to thank many of you for taking our classified briefing and offer it to any of you or your staff between now and endgame. When you see what we're trading for, our budget submission will make perfect sense. If we are to achieve truly meaningful gains for our nation's security through implementing the NDS in a flat budget environment, we must work together on these hard trades. Chairman, I'm honored to be the 21st Chief of Staff of the Air Force. If we go to war this year against a nuclear peer, I am 100% confident we have what we need to win. And I can say that because of decisions made by our predecessors, men like John Jumper and Mike Ryan, such as the lead time for building an air and a space force. I believe it is our job to ensure that when Air Chief 24 sits in front of this committee in 2030, side by side with Space Chief number 4, they will be able to state with equal confidence that our nation's air and space forces have what they need to win. And with your support, we can achieve this goal. Thank you, sir.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, distinguished members of the committee, it's an honor to testify before this committee this morning. This is my first appearance in front of the entire committee, and I think it underscores the significance our nation has placed in elevating space to a level commensurate with its importance to national security. Since the historic establishment of the United States Space Force on December 20th, 2019, we've been moving out with speed and focus to meet the requirements of the National Defense Strategy. As the Air Force's first, as the Space Force's first Chief of Space Operations, I am humbled by the great responsibility entrusted to me, and on behalf of the space professionals that I am privileged to lead, I would like to personally thank you for your leadership in establishing our new service. Under the strong leadership of Secretary Barrett, and I would note that the Secretary made the establishment of the United States Space Force the #1 priority for the Department of the Air Force, and shoulder to shoulder with my partner and fellow Service Chief Dave Goldfein, we are establishing a Space Force that is lean, agile, and mission-focused. You have given us an opportunity to build this service to enhance the lethality of our joint force while optimizing our ability to dominate in space. I want to also, if you'll allow me to take a minute to thank Dave and Dawn Goldfein for their leadership of the United States Air Force. I've had the privilege of serving under General Goldfein's leadership for several years, and I've known him longer. I will tell you, leadership is a team sport, and there is no better team to follow than Dave and Dawn Goldfein. So, sir, thank you. For the decades, the United States has had the luxury of operating in a benign space environment, operating the world's best capabilities to fuel our American way of life and our American way of war. Today, potential adversaries have taken notice and are catching up fast. Although we remain the best in the world, our advantage is eroding as adversaries are building space capabilities for their own benefit and fielding counter-space systems to negate our access to space and the advantage that that access provides to our nation and those of our allies. This budget prioritizes space. It funds it to a level of $15.4 billion, representing approximately a $900 million increase this fiscal year. Specifically, the budget funds for a strong pivot towards space superiority and the foundational elements of space situational awareness, command and control, and training infrastructure that's required. Our national defense strategy demands it, and I appreciate the support you have provided over the last couple of years, and I ask for your strong support once again. You know, it's been 73 years since the United States established a separate armed service. That was the Air Force. I've spent 35 and a half years in that service, proudly in that service, but in December, I transferred over to the Space Force, and now I'm about a little over 2 months in. We have been given an unprecedented opportunity to build a service unconstrained by past constructs and thinking. And we are taking full advantage of this occasion to do just that, with a forward-looking, innovative approach that seeks to optimize manning, flatten organizations, and streamline processes necessary to move at speed. When fully established, we may not look like other services you've become accustomed to, but we will be equally proficient at providing space forces ready and willing to protect U.S. allied interests in space while providing unequaled capability to the joint force. This is critical given the warfighting domain that we find ourselves in today. To that end, I am so proud of the professionals that I am privileged to lead. They are conducting their mission with an eager boldness that will ensure America remains the best in the world at space, and we look forward to your questions. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you all very much. I have obviously many questions, but I'll narrow it down to one because I've had the opportunity to speak with you before. There's quite a bit of discussion on the budget about in the nuclear area, General Goldfein. The NNSA budget was roughly $17.5 billion. There was concern about that, and at the last minute, there was $2.5 billion put back in and taken away from some other things, and those some other things are not happy about it. But for the moment, focusing on that $2.5 billion, can you explain to us what it is, how important it is to the overall nuclear enterprise, and if it's important, why the President's original budget didn't have it in it?
Sir, as you know, there's a balance between NNSA that gives us the actual warheads and then the Department of Defense.
Understood.
And it's always a balancing act between the two. And as I understand, at Endgame, when they took a look at the investment that we required to get the warheads we need, balanced with the investment we're making in the enterprise for the bomb bodies, delivery mechanisms, that the department made a decision at the OSD level to put money in the NSSA account. So that's about as much detail as I understand on that.
Okay. But well, you're putting together the nuclear enterprise here, so you got the $2.5 billion. you don't got the $2.5 billion. How does that affect your ability to get our nuclear forces where you think they need to be?
So right now, the impact has been minimal on the Air Force, based on the fact that what you'll see in our budget is fully funded for our nuclear programs. So we were able to put the money that's required for the B-21, the long-range standoff, and the ground-based strategic deterrent. Those are fully funded in our program. So the 2.5 actually didn't have an impact on the Air Force.
Well, no, I understand that. I'm speaking to you as the person who's, and I also understand that NNSA is in charge of, giving you the material you need to put into all these things.
Sure.
But you are kind of overseeing to make sure that you don't just have a B-21, you actually have the nuclear missiles in it
Right.
to make it useful. So you don't have an opinion on that $2.5 billion fight?
Sir, I don't, only because it was happening at a much higher level. What we brought forward was a fully funded program for all of the portions that the Air Force is responsible for.
Understood.
One of the areas that is very similar to what you're describing is nuclear command and control, and making sure that our portion, which is about 75% of what all comes together, and maybe Chief Raymond may pitch in here because so much of what we do in nuclear command and control is actually done from space, but we also needed to make sure that that portion was fully funded.
Understood. That's all I have. I'll yield to Mr. Thornberry.
General Goldfein, you were describing what's required to keep the Air Force moving forward in a flat budget. I'd respectfully add one more thing to your list, and that is get your money on time, because you can do more if you've got a whole year to plan versus some of the other alternatives, and that makes a difference too. Let me pick up on kind of part of where the chairman was going. So the Air Force is responsible for 2 legs of the triad plus a large part of nuclear command and control. There are some people who suggest, well, it's not that big a deal if we can delay replacement of the land-based leg of the triad, or maybe manned bombers are a thing of the past. Can you just briefly describe your view on where we are with those programs that are under the Air Force responsibility, and how much slack there is or is not in the schedule and funding for those?
Yes, sir. Unfortunately, that we've actually delayed this recapitalization point where we really don't have any slop left in the schedule. The ground-based, the Minuteman missile is 44 years old. We're getting to a point where there's time components in that missile that you actually no longer have vendors that can produce those. So, and we're quite frankly, we're behind our adversaries in many ways. Russia has actually completed its triad recapitalization, and we're actually just getting started in ours. So we really have not allowed any slop in the system right now for us to be able to go forward and do anything but recapitalize all 3 legs. And I would just finish on saying that the nuclear posture review that we all went through reconfirmed the need for all 3 legs of the triad, and I think Admiral Richard confirmed that as well in his testimony early last week.
Okay. General Raymond, one of the questions involving Space Force is who's responsible for space acquisition? And I know there's a bit of a tussle maybe, or I understand there may be a bit of a tussle going on in the department and so forth. Can you just give us a few comments on space acquisition, who decides, and how you see that going forward?
That's a great question. I think one of the benefits of standing up a Space Force, near-term benefits, will be to bring some unity of effort across the department towards that end. One of the homework assignments that was in the NDAA was for us to come back to Congress with a process for how we wanted to do acquisition. We're going through that right now. In my opinion, I think there's a way to do this to, 1, keep the speed up because we have to move fast. 2, unite efforts across a group of folks that do this towards a common architecture that we're all rowing in the same direction, and reduce duplication. I'm excited for the prospects. I think you expect the Space Force to deliver that to you, and we're working that hard. We've already got the team putting that together. I'm going to see the draft of that this next week, and it'll be coming to meet the timelines that Congress laid out.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Goldfein, I'm also the chair of the Aviation Subcommittee, and so we deal a lot with pilots and pilot shortages. And so I wanted to ask you about how the U.S. Air Force is thinking about pilot shortages, and as well maybe the bow wave, the idea of the recapitalization and the kind of platforms we might be flying, and where the numbers of seats in the number of rear ends in the seats meets the number of platforms that actually need them versus the transition to unmanned.
No, thanks, sir, and thanks for your leadership on this. You know, we say it from the beginning, this is a national level issue, not an Air Force level issue. The nation actually is not producing enough pilots to service military, commercial, and business aviation. From the military standpoint, as the airlines continue to hire in large numbers, we're about holding our own, I would describe right now, in terms of our pilot shortage. We're about 2,000 short. We've been about 2,000 short. That's against a denominator of about a 21,000 pilot requirement across the Air Force. We're starting to see positive trends in terms of retention, but it's too early to declare any kind of victory. Congress has been very helpful with the authorization you have given us for bonuses, but I will tell you that most pilots are not truly motivated by money. It's very important to them, but they are motivated by quality of service. And everything we're doing as an Air Force is ensuring that flying in the United States Air Force is as rich an experience as we can make it. And we're making that rich at the squadron level. So I'm seeing positive trends, but right now we're sort of holding our own.
Okay. So a couple of things that your Air Force is doing. One is on using AI on predictive maintenance to save costs, and then the digital design technology application of that to the T7. But in your testimony, especially on the T7, you talk about how it's saving money. So, given that you've had you found $21 billion in savings to reinvest, for those two examples, would we find that in the budget where the money's been saved and has been put back into something else, whether it's because of the application of a new design and manufacturing process, or because of the money you're saving on predictive maintenance?
Sir, in a flat budget with less spending power, you're not going to see that money, as much of that money in terms of increased investment. What you're going to see that is filling the holes we have in weapon system sustainment. So you talked about two areas. One, which is how do you use artificial intelligence when it comes to predictive maintenance? We have 3 weapon systems now that we're taking commercial best practices, C5 as an example, and using predictive maintenance to make sure that we decrease the amount of time in depots, be more predictive about when we need to put them in depot, and we're actually saving a lot of time and a significant amount of money. We're reflowing that back into weapon system sustainment to drive our readiness rates up. On the T7, here's to me the most exciting thing about the T7 when I went out and took a look at it. They engineered this aircraft through digital design, which is different than digital manufacturing. They actually designed it through digital means so that they were able to marry a fuselage with a wing in some number of hours with like 4 people. That's unheard of in the business of aircraft manufacture. So not only are we designing things well, we're building them more effectively and more efficiently. That's going to result in savings.
General, I had a question for you too, but why don't I ask you this, and you can, with the time left, I'll be quick, but a question for you is about space professionals and given your stand-up Space Force, how many folks are moving over, but where are your gaps in people that you need to develop to fill in those gaps?
Yeah, well, so we have so today there's one person in the United States Space Force. That's me. And so
you're doing a great job.
There's plenty of gaps.
Or he or she is doing a great job, whoever that is.
Yeah. In a couple weeks, we're going to swear in number 2, and that's Chief Master Sergeant Roger Toberman. There's incredible interest in this. This May, we're going to direct commission just shy of 65 cadets from the Air Force Academy directly commissioned into the United States Space Force. We just advertised 40 positions, civilian positions, for the staff at the Pentagon. We had over 5,000 applicants for those 40 positions. There is an excitement about space in every single sector. And so where we're focusing on is not the support part. We're going to rely for about 80% of that work. All is going to be relied upon on the Air Force. What we're doing is building a mission-focused space expertise with some related engineering, data, software, cyber that will be necessary to fight and win this fight going forward.
All right, and I'll come back to you later on a tech question. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to clarify a few comments by the chairman with respect to the NNSA budget. There really is only, and I agree with the chairman on the need for clarification for the NSA budget so that we can have a debate and hopefully a clarity, the efficiency and effectiveness of what we're spending there. We just had a hearing in the Strategic Forces Subcommittee yesterday where the Administrator Lisa Gordon-Haggerty testified. The only original budget of the President's budget is the President's budget. There are always documents that are floating around of requests for different levels. NNSA's original request by the Administrator was for the 19 plus 7, I think 19.7 that actually has moved forward in the President's budget. And I know the President was always in support of that full amount. So we would always hope that as the President puts his budget together that there is full discussion as to increase or decreases. But General Goldfein, I want to thank you for your service. I want to thank you for that you got us through sequestration, the difficulties of the effects upon readiness, and seeing the advances that our adversaries have made in both missiles and fighters and cyber and unmanned aerial systems, and the need to then fashion a force that can face that in the future. I do want to go back to the chairman's issue on the NNSA budget. I know that you're not in charge of that budget. NNSA is under DOE, not DOD, so you wouldn't have been part of putting that together. I understand your reticence there, wanting to comment on the elements in their budget. However, Admiral Richard from U.S. Stratcom Commander testified recently before us that failure to undertake the NNSA's modernization plan would be the effect of unilateral disarmament. General Goldfein, you know what the condition is of our nuclear forces and what we're facing. Do you agree with Admiral Richard?
Sir, I do.
Okay, excellent. Madam Secretary, as we go forward with Space Force, I agree with the chairman. We have to make certain that what we're doing is effective and efficient, that we don't just build new bureaucracies, that we don't duplicate things. Secretary of Defense Esper was in front of us, and I raised the issue of NASIC with him. And General Raymond was before the Strategic Forces Subcommittee, and I raised NASIC again with General Raymond. As you know, the National Air and Space Intelligence Center actively works to bring together intelligence, both from our space assets and looking at the threats that we face in the air and the space. Secretary Esper has been to NASIC. I just spoke before the McLeese Defense Program Conference, and my first question was about NASIC, and it wasn't from someone from Ohio, and it wasn't someone from Dayton, so even though this is a parochial issue, it is, I believe, an operational issue for the Air Force. Secretary Esper said that we do not want to, as we look to creating assets that are dedicated to the Space Force, break anything that works, duplicate existing missions, and we, of course, want to avoid unnecessary redundancies. When you look to the issue of a National Space Intelligence Center, like if you would comment, because there are a number of people throughout the Air Force enterprise that are as excited as General Raymond said about joining the Space Force and making certain that it's successful, but at the same time don't want the things that we currently have broken or diminished. If you could speak about that for those who are serving at NASIC, I think it would be very beneficial for them. Madam Secretary.
Member Turner, the NASIC is a national treasure. What it provides is very important to the entire Department of the Air Force, and with the support of the Secretary of Defense and the intelligence community, we would intend to continue and count upon, rely upon, and not break the expertise that is found at NASIC.
Thank you, Secretary Barrett. General Goldfein, we're all concerned about pilots and the pilot shortage, and looking to the FY21 request, there are a number of people who are concerned, obviously, that it looks like you're decreasing the number of new pilots in the process that would be in the process through funding. Could you explain that to us and give us some insights there?
Sir, actually, we've gone from about a little over 1,100 pilots that we produced in 16 to about 1,317. We're on track to produce 1,480. That's our target. And we think if we can get 1,480 a year, we're on track to doing that in 24, no later then we'll be able to keep a steady state of what we need to be able to fly. Part of what's going on with the reduced numbers is a combination of grounding. This last year we had some issues, as you remember, with the T6 and the oxygen system, and so we lost a number of sorties that we're not going to be able to make up. So the numbers, we didn't hit our goal last year. So now what we're doing is trying to look at a combination of pilot training next, which is using new technology to train in a different way, but to the same or higher standard, to be able to shorten the course length and increase more pilots. When I went through...
and I'm sorry, if you could wrap up that point. The gentleman is over time. I want to get to the other members, but I don't want to interrupt you if you just wrap up.
If there's time later, I could talk about pilot training next. We're using new technology to train differently.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Garamendi.
General Goldfein, thank you for all the years. It's been a pleasure working with you, and I'm sure all of us will miss your competent work. Several things are on my mind. Just keep in mind that there's an $8 billion reserve account in the NNSA that apparently is to be used someday, somehow. So what's another $2 billion for? Good question. We should ask that question. Which brings me to an accounting issues. You're moving money back and forth within the Air Force accounts, weapons sustainment, money moving here from flight time and around OCO money moving. I'm not going to get into it, but I'm asking my staff to get into the details of your accounting system so that we can understand where the money is and for what its purpose is. So not here. It's far too much detail. General Raymond, with regard to the Space Force, good. Eventually you'll have the entire force in hand. I would ask you to keep in mind the role that the National Guard currently plays in space, not only in California at Beale Air Force Base, which is significant. How you move that in is going to be extremely important to maintain the capabilities that you presently have. I would urge you not to break it up, bring it in whole, and we can go into that in detail as I did yesterday at the hearing. The F-35. Two things about the F-35. One, the Alice system. I guess we can solve that problem by giving it a new name. Probably not, although that seems to be what would be happening here. Heads up, we're not going to back off on this. The spurs are on, and we're going to ride hard until we get this resolved. It's a readiness issue. It's also an issue for my colleague over here, Mr. Norcross. Quick comment on it, Secretary Barrett, Goldfein, either the two of you or both. Can I count on you getting this resolved?
The F-35 is of urgent importance to us.
How will you get it resolved?
And I'll ask the Chief to address that.
So I sat down with the CEO, all the CEOs, and told them point blank, I'm going to get a question in Congress. And the question is, why should we buy you more F-35s when you can't sustain the ones you have and they're too expensive to fly? And I said, I've got to have a better answer to that question. They got on it. I went down to Lockheed. I spent an entire day with them. Alice to Odin is not just a name change. We are involved in the requirements for that system. Our Kessel Run software designers and developers are deeply involved in this, and we're having a far more mature discussion about data that we need to have. But, sir, we need this committee to keep its boot on the throat of this program, along with us, to make sure that we drive these costs down, because right now it's not affordable. Here's the good news. I've seen more movement on this in the program in the last 6 months than I've seen in the last 2 years.
Well, I think Lockheed Martin's here in the audience, and they know that they're in deep trouble. And so are you. This has to be resolved. It cannot continue on. And yes, Alice is only one piece of the problem. There are the depots, and this cuts across all the departments, and it's a problem for each and every department. We'll start, since you're here. Heads up, we'll get into it in detail offline, but know that this is a major, major concern. You are moving into this joint domain issue in a very big way. You've moved a lot of assets out of the, what I would call readiness, that is here and now, at least for the next decade, moving those assets over to the 2030 period of time when most of this will come online. There are significant concerns. KC-10s, KC-35s disappearing, really? Transcom says, well, maybe not a good idea. Could you please comment on this issue? And I understand you're rethinking this part of the budget.
Sir, this is the common tension that you will always see between a combatant commander that has a near-term requirement and a service chief that's building a force to win in 2030. And so we could have the same discussion about tankers, fighters, bombers, command and control, ISR. So in the tanker business, two options, two things I want to tell you. First of all, if we go to war into a high-end fight in terms of mitigation, we have already told the combatant command and the Secretary of Defense that we would put every KC-46 into a high-end fight.
Even
we
though
would
it
not
doesn't work?
use it for day-to-day operations, but we'd use it for high-end combat operations. What we're asking for is a 3% retirement, representing 3% of the KC-135 fleet. And so we're working through that with the Secretary of Defense now, but it's a reasonable trade.
Thank you.
And you have a 25% failure rate on the
Actually, if I could ask this question, the comment under his breath there that I think you missed was the notion that the KC-46 fundamentally doesn't work. I think that's actually an important question to address before we move on. Does it have problems, or does it fundamentally not work?
So we're having significant issues with the remote visual system. It's a hardware problem that requires a hardware fix. I sent a letter to the CEO, Mr. Calhoun. He came to see me 3 days later. We sat down. He committed to me that this is his #1 priority for getting this back on track. I've seen a different behavior from that company since he's taken over. We're on final, so I want to be careful about negotiations, but we think we have a good fix.
Of the many issues in your portfolio, getting a clear picture as to how we get the KC-46 to actually function like it's supposed to is a pretty big one. So we'll definitely, I know Mr. Norcross will definitely be following up with you on that as well. Mr. Lamborn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all three of you for your contribution to our national defense, and General Goldfein, you will be missed. My first question is for Secretary Barrett and General Raymond. It has been a pleasure working with both of you throughout the stand-up of Space Command and the creation of Space Force. As you know already, I believe that Colorado Springs is the best option for that permanent location. We've had this conversation a time or two, actually more than that, based on many factors ranging from location, civilian and military workforce, existing infrastructure and capabilities, and quality of life for service members and their families, but I'm not going to go into that today. When it comes, though, to the Guard and Reserve personnel, one of the 4 space wings which are in Colorado is a Air Reserve component of the Air Force. And there are also 630 National Guardsmen conducting space missions in our state. The synergy that we see between active duty and reserve component in space operations multiplies the capacity of the force, saves money, and retains talent. Now, I'm aware that there's a proposal to continue to study the role of the reserve component as it relates to the Space Force, but I believe this delay would create a gap in continuity for the space operators currently in the National Guard and jeopardizes the readiness of these unit-trained and equipped formations. So my question on this, is there anything holding back the establishment of a Space National Guard in this coming year?
We are very much, we cannot go to war, we cannot do our jobs without the Guard and Reserve. They're very much valued partners in the process. The Space Guard and Reserve, we're going to spend a little time looking at to incorporate that workforce in a way that we might be building a new design, a new paradigm for how that's done. The Chief has given a great deal of thought to it, and I'd invite his comments.
Yeah, Congressman Rogers, I agree with everything he said. We are reliant on the Guard and Reserve today. The 310th Space Wing at Schriever's, the wing you were talking about, there's about 1,400 guardsmen between the Army and the Air Force that provide space capabilities as well. We rely on them today, and we're going to need that in the future. We've been directed by law to do a review of this. And so we're going to follow the law. The National Defense Authorization Act of 20 tells us to do this review. We're going to do this review. We have an opportunity to look at how would we do this, and are there more efficient ways to do it for a service that's going to be about 16,000 people that's custom built for this domain. So we're going to do that. We'll meet the requirements of the law, but I will assure you that there is going to be no lapse in capability that is provided today. The Guard and Reserve can fully support what we're doing today as they are today. We're going to move out diligently with speed to answer Congress with the direction that we were given in the law.
Okay, thank you both for that answer. And General Raymond, as best as you can in an open setting, can you share with us some of the characteristics a permanent National Security Space Command and Control Center needs to have to successfully fight and win wars that extend into space?
We have two really successful C2 centers today. One is in Schriever Air Force Base, the National Space Defense Center. One's at Colorado Springs. You have to have the ability to ingest data. You have to have the right expertise. You have to have relationships and connections with our allied partners. You have to be able to communicate broadly with all those that you have to communicate with, including those that are forward in theater. Those are some top-level items that I'd put at the top of the list.
Okay, thank you. And then my last question, General Raymond. I know you had a space warfighting doctrine conference at Peterson Air Force Base in January to coordinate and move forward with writing the document that will dictate how our joint force will fight wars that extend into space. And I believe it's accurate to say that your work, that product, will be used to determine the finalized force organization and equipment requirements for our space warfighters. So where are we at? What is the status report on writing the Department of Defense's space warfighting doctrine, and when do you think this will be finished, and how is it coming along?
Thank you for the question. We've had space doctrine before. It's doctrine that was built largely for a benign domain. That's not good enough today. And when on 20 December, when the U.S. Space Force was stood up, one of the fundamental things, in my opinion, that an independent service has to do, it's got to develop its own people, and it has to develop its own doctrine. And so we pulled the team together. We put a first draft of what we call a capstone document. That will continue to get further reviewed here over the next couple months, and then we look forward to publishing that. And then there'll be several series levels of doctrine, including joint doctrine in my U.S. Space Command hat that will also follow.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate your service. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Lamborn. Chair now recognizes Representative Norcross for 5 minutes.
Thank you. First of all, General Goldfein, thanks you so much for your service over years, and we particularly appreciate your frankness when you address so many of our tough questions. But I want to follow up on the question of the KC-46s.
Representative Norcross, can you pull a microphone really close to your mouth there? Thanks a lot.
The KC-46s. We're retiring some of the 135s at a little bit more of accelerated pace than we expected, and along with KC-10s. But as said, and you mentioned it earlier, in a high-end fight, we could use the 46s. Describe to us what a high-end fight looks like.
Sir, if we would go to a high-end contingency fight, either a peer fight or one where the Secretary of Defense asked me whether in high-end combat operations, whether I would be comfortable using the KC-46, I would take that risk. We've already done the operational analysis, and we would do that. We will not take that risk during day-to-day operations. And it has to do, quite frankly, with the remote visual system that very quickly, the last 10 feet, when the boom operator is trying to plug the receiver, the system was not designed well in terms of that final focus. So we're having more out of contacts around the airplane. I would take that risk in combat. I would not take that risk in day-to-day operations.
That describes it. The stiffness of the boom is only with the A-10, which may or may not be part of that. Just want to switch over to the modernization, talking about the ISR. There's not a combatant commander that we have a discussion with. There's virtually nobody we deal with day-to-day doesn't need more. Yet it appears that we're going to cut this high and dry, and particularly the notable is the Global Hawk Block 20 and 30. Would you walk us through that decision-making? Because it appears we're going to have a real lull here.
Yes, sir. There's no better example I can give you of how when we connect sensors and shooters and weapons together in a networked approach, we actually bring up capability and capacity because we're making use of those that are not connected today. So what I can't describe for you in an open hearing, and I'd love to do in a closed session, is where we're going on the classified side in terms of bringing survivable capability together. that offsets some of what we're trying to take down in those that are not survivable. But when you tie them together and you get the sensors actually comparing and fusing information, you actually increase your capacity of ISR.
We understand. We were just out at Palmdale to see some of what we're doing. But for that 4-year period, or is what they're calling a bathtub effect, is we're going down to zero and producing as new ones. What you just described to us is going to take place of those new planes that we would have instead of those?
Not one for one, but there is absolutely a replacement there. But there's also a factor that we have to think about, which is, everything we produce in all the services is a standalone operating computer and sensor. And when we can tie those computers, think about, anything that rolls, submerges,
Sure.
floats, flies, or orbits is a sensor. When we can actually fuse and make use of that information and not do it independently, you actually get a much better picture with greater fidelity earlier in the fight than if you just operate on a standalone basis. And that's why, as we move from platforms to networks, we actually increase our capability.
So we would expect to hear from our commanders that their view is going to change in asking for this. So that will be a cultural change we'll have to deal with. For my remaining time, I yield to Mr. Crow.
Thank you, Mr. Norcross. Thank you to all of you for your testimony today. Secretary Barrett and General Raymond, I've appreciated your discussions on Space Force. As you know, I represent Buckley Air Force Base in Aurora, which is about to become Buckley Space Base next month. Could you provide a quick update for us on the timing of the basing discussion for U.S. Space Command and the criteria being used? And I affiliate with Mr. Lamborn's comments on the importance of Colorado. Of course, I think Buckley is just slightly better than Colorado Springs on the basing.
Well, we're all very excited about the future there. With the stand-up of the Space Force, much of what had been operating in Colorado is moving to Washington, or there will be some that will move to Washington. As we redesign that system, we are going to reopen the process and put forward criteria in detail and invite all who think they have a good shot at it to come and represent their communities for that possible basing choice.
And when will that reopening occur?
It'll be this spring. It'll be announced.
Thank you.
So the chief may have further to add.
Thank you. Actually, we're out of time at the moment. So, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for being here today. And I especially appreciate your service. I am the son of, he's a late veteran of the 14th Air Force. He cherished his service with the people of India and China. And that was always meaningful to me. And then growing up in the holy city of Charleston, South Carolina, we appreciate the Charleston Air Force Base and the capabilities, the C-17s, everything there. Additionally, I'm the grateful uncle of a member of the Air Force, a Citadel graduate, so obviously a very bright fellow. So thank you for being here. And Secretary Barrett, F-35 aircraft provide peace through strength. There are 11 companies in South Carolina who provide the equipment for the F-35. We're grateful that the Marine Corps Air Station Beaufort is home to F-35 pilot training and will eventually have up to 90 F-35B aircraft, and the people of Beaufort County love the sound of freedom. We would gladly welcome also F-35s at McEntire Joint Air Base and Shore Air Force Base. The Air Force 2021 unfunded priority list requests an additional 12 F-35s. And Madam Secretary, fifth generation strike aircraft capability is a top priority of the Air Force. What can be done to promote 60 F-35As in your budget?
Mr. Wilson, we'd be delighted to have those additional aircraft, of course, but we have to live within the budget proposal put forward, and we, of course, will comply beyond that. And I would invite the chief to add to that.
Sir, we ended the last discussion on F-35 on a bit of a negative tone, talking about sustainment. I think it's important for me also to tell you on the record what I think of it operationally. It is performing brilliantly. My fellow air chief, the Israeli air chief, called me and said, "Hey, Dave," he goes, "I'm not integrating the F-35 into the Israeli Air Force. I'm integrating the Israeli Air Force into the F-35. I can't give you a better statement of what 5th Gen is all about. This one's a game changer. It's brilliant in its performance operationally. We just got to work on the sustainment piece.
And General, thank you so much for pointing that out. And indeed, to work with our ally Israel and provide peace through strength, you're doing that. So thank you. And General Goldfein, South Carolina is pleased to have the 20th Fighter Wing at Shaw Air Force Base and the 169th Fighter Wing at McEntire Joint Air Base. We know that the Air Force has had success in growing its size of the maintenance community, although not at the desired 80% mark. I'm thankful the F-16 mission-capable rates are improving. What is the plan and timeline to improve the mission readiness for F-16s to meet or surpass the 80% goal?
Well, with the support of this committee, sir, and the money that we've had since 18, we were in a downward spiral. We've been able to get upwards of 13% overall readiness rates and 34% improvement in our pacing units. The pacing units are those units we've identified that will go first into a China or Russia fight. And so we've been able to improve now just in that short period of time. The F-16 is on that track, but I will tell you that we've got some significant modifications that we're doing that are going to require us to put the F-16s through depot. And that's going to lower our overall mission capable rate, but we mitigate that as we get it back out of depot at a higher level of capability.
Thank you very much, General. And General Raymond, again, you're a person of history, now to be the first person to be the leader of space operations. Congratulations. One of the major focuses of Space Force is ensuring that space systems can be developed and acquired at the speed of innovation. What a challenge. What are your perspectives on how to fix the system space unique acquisition challenges?
Thanks for that question. I think it's one of the fundamental tenets of the National Defense Authorization Act, the reason for the Space Force. I think we have to go at speed. Our adversaries are going fast, and we need to go faster. I think it begins with requirements. You have to streamline requirements. I think it begins with having an architecture that everybody agrees to, and that's why when the law said that the Space Force will be responsible for the architectures of the national security space architectures, I think that's really important to get everybody rowing in the same direction. I think software, to go back to Mr. Larson's question, we are already designing how we want to do software in this force to be able to go fast, to be more software-based rather than hardware-based.
And America is grateful for each of your service. Thank you so much for what you do protecting American families. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Secretary Barrett, what are your thoughts about the right mix of 5th generation and 4th generation aircraft?
Well, we're going to do well to have the low observability that 5th generation allows, but there's a good role also for the 4th generation, and we're going to continue to see that as a balance and as a correct mix. I'd invite the Chief of Air Force to add to that.
So right now we're about 2040. We think by about 2030 we'll be right in the 50-50. About 2040 time frame, we're projected to be at about 60-40. Okay. That's about the right target, I think, going forward.
So you'd say a good mix then?
A good mix, and I will tell you at some point in the future we're going to be talking about the same thing in a 5th, 6th gen mix.
Right. And so I agree with that. But so kind of considering what you guys just said, if we need proven capable aircraft, why is the Air Force announcing the intent to retire 44 A-10 Warthogs without giving us more details?
The A-10 story, I'll tell you that, as I said yesterday in the SAS, Senator McSally and many others have done a great job really saving the A-10. So the A-10 is going to fly well through the 2030s. We're putting almost $1 billion into the A-10, updating its wings, updating its avionics, updating its radios. There is no better platform for close air support, and we're going to keep that into the 2030s.
So then, okay, I get what you're saying, Joe, and so that's why I'm confused. So why are we planning to retire then if we're putting this much investment in them? The 44.
Because we're fleet managing, sir, across the fleet. KC-135s, KC-10s, Global Hawks, A-10s, right? We're taking the oldest airframes that are unaffordable to keep flying, and then putting that money and that manpower back in the existing system and buying new technology.
But also just wanted to point out that we have been very clear, as in Congress, specifically the House Armed Services Committee through the 2017 NDAA, that there is not to be any reduction of the A-10 until there is a study between the F-35 and the A-10. And that study is coming out when?
So that study is complete. I've talked to the director of OT&E. It's actually, he's prepared to offer that as an interim report, but he's right now planning on delivering that in September with the full IOT&E report on the F-35.
But the 2017 NDA says that you do not do any movement, any decision on the A-10 until you come and deliver that report. Right now, you've made a decision without delivering us the report. So, in my opinion, you're in violation of the 2017 NDA. Is that not, what else should I take from that?
Well, sir, we had this discussion yesterday as well with the SASC. You know, when we looked through it and looked at the language, given that we were going to give you the report on the first month of the fiscal year and the timing that is laid out in the law, there is actual time between the end of the FIDEP to conclude this. But I will tell you, we understand the law and we will follow it.
Okay. Now, I understand that there has been a change in the plan from the first initiation or the first release of the plan. And yesterday, when you were talking on the Senate side, that you guys have a new plan for the A-10. So what is the details of this new plan?
So the only plan we have right now is the one that's in the President budget. I'd be happy to get with you offline on this dialogue that we're having.
Great. I do want to say for the record, Mr. Chairman, that this is very, very discouraging, though, and also just to my fellow witnesses in front, that we are moving in this direction after we have been very clear as Congress, as the Armed Services Committee, certainly in a bipartisan manner. I've been in support of the A-10 Warthog when the Obama administration tried to get rid of it. I've been here fighting when the Trump administration got rid of it, not just because it's based in Arizona, because I do think it's a capable fighting platform, and it basically saved my ass in Operation Matador in Al-Qaim. And as much as I love F-35, I don't want to be using a $1 billion platform to support infantrymen. That's not smart, and it's just not a smart use of our money. And going into the future, the Air Force may only want to fight in the air or in the space domain, but no matter what, there will always be infantrymen, and they'll always need close air combat support. And whatever platforms are out there right now, the best one, the cheapest one, the strongest one, certainly if something ever happens, especially in Russia, with Russia surging into the Eastern European theater, is still the A-10. So I make sure I look forward to that report. But I think we need to be very, very clear that this Congress, the Senate, has said that until we see something that's a better replacement for the A-10, that A-10 is not going anywhere. Thank you. I yield back my time.
Sir, can I?
Sorry, Budge.
1 minute?
Yes.
Sir,
Quickly. Sorry.
Sir, if I just offer that, number one, we're going to put whatever we need to support soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines on the ground, whatever it takes, regardless of the cost. You're looking at a guy who was shot down in combat, got up the next night, went and flew, and I flew close air support. Let there be no mistake on the commitment of the United States Air Force. We fly to the sound of the guns, and we support everybody on the ground, or we die trying.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very pleased to see the Air Force here in its new structure. It's great for our nation. I know this is your first NDA, Secretary Barrett. You know I'm a big fan of yours, and General Raymond knows how I feel. But I want, for the record, to thank General Goldfein for his many years of service. He is an incredibly respected general officer and has done an admirable job. And on behalf of a thankful nation, let you want to say for the record, I appreciate you. General Goldfein, the Space Force has begun a significant investment in OPIR architecture to replace SBIRS. Can you tell me what that's going to look like and if we're going to be able to meet the 2025 timetable?
I think you meant that for me.
Did I not say General Raymond?
Yeah, okay.
I'm sorry, I might not have.
No. This is a critical capability for our nation. It provides the unblinking eye for detecting against missiles that are coming into our country. Interestingly, there is also the replacement for the system that provided warning to our troops in Iraq when Iran launched missiles.
What I'm after is, how's it going to look different than SBIRS?
Yeah, so what this program does, it's a more, and I can go into much more details in a closed hearing, but it is a more defendable capability than SBIRS. And when we made that trade a couple years ago to shift from SBIRS 7.8 to next generation OPIR, it was because of that defendability. It includes a geo segment, a polar segment, It includes the ground architecture as well. And with the support of this committee, the 804 authorities that we had, we're, I think, 18 months, we got an 18 months head start on prototyping, and we just completed some hardware integration testing that was 4 years ahead of its predecessor SIBRs.
So you're confident we're going to make
I'm
2025?
confident we're going to make 2025, and we're fully funded with this funding to do that.
Okay, you recently signed out a fighting SATCOM strategy.
That's right.
Tell me what that is.
Yes, sir, I'll be happy to. It's really important. Our adversaries are developing capabilities or have capabilities that can jam satellite communications. We have to be able to fight in a contested domain. When you travel overseas and you turn your iPhone on, it links up to whatever network that you go to. Last year's NDA provided me the authority to procure commercial SATCOM, and we think there's a great opportunity here working with the commercial industry to bring commercial SATCOM and military SATCOM closer together and provide a resilient hybrid network that says if a warfighter is on this satellite and it gets jammed or loses contact for whatever reason, it can automatically switch over to another satellite, whether it's commercial or military. And that's the gist of that strategy.
Great. General Goldfein, the Air Force recently realigned $4.1 billion across the FIDEP. That according to the Air Force budget documents are being used to invest in 4 broad categories: connect the joint force, dominate space, generate combat power, and conduct logistics under attack. Would you please elaborate on the specific types of investments being made with this budget request and address the priority areas?
Yes, sir, and Chief Raymond talked to the space piece. Let me just focus on the connecting the joint force. We're on path to do every 4 months, we connect portions of the joint team that is not currently connected through the digital engineering and common data architecture, and then we solve problems. So we're all going, all the Joint Chiefs, we're all headed to Nellis Air Force Base in April. And we have 3 supported commanders that we're going to produce all domain options for them by connecting capabilities. This is going to be a live fly exercise. We're going to have ships off the Gulf. We're going to have Marines at Yuma. We're going to have Army at White Sands Missile Range. We're going to be flying at Nellis. And we're going to do this joint all-domain command and control demonstration to pull this all together in a homeland defense scenario. We learn every time we do it. A year ago, we were talking about this, and it was mostly aspirational lightning bolts on PowerPoint charts. There was not a lot behind it. Today, we're not talking about cloud architecture. We have one. We contracted it. It's up and operating, and all the services are connected to it. We're not talking about common data architecture. We actually have it up and running. So what you're seeing is about $2.5 billion that we put forward to connect this joint team. And I'll end with, of all the things that we're doing, this has the most promise of producing a joint team that can win in 2030.
Thank you.
I would, if I could pile onto that for 2 seconds as well. This is absolutely critical for space. We have to operate at great distances at speed. And the work that we've been doing in what we used to call Enterprise Space Battle Management C2 is lashed into that joint all-domain C2 and is providing a lot of the data architecture that it's using.
Great. I would just close by pointing out we're going to have a new seal on the wall when y'all got one.
Yes, sir. I'll deliver it and we'll hang it together.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Everybody seems very concerned about that. There's a balance issue because we have 3 on one side, 3 on the other. So we're gonna have to figure out the logistics of that. But Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses. Again, it's a good opportunity to talk the other day, and appreciate you coming by. I know the issue of the remote visual system has been brought up by other members. I'm not going to belabor the point. I just want to, again, emphasize that as we get closer to markup on the Sea Power and Projection Forces Subcommittee, we have to make a decision about building more planes that we know are going to have to be fairly significantly retrofitted. So to the extent that, this comes to a conclusion in terms of what that retrofit looks like, frankly, it would, I think, just make for common sense budgeting so that we know, what we're paying for. And again, we had a good discussion on that, and I hope, again, just to, see that dovetail as we get closer to the timeline for decisions here. The other question I just want to touch on is the Air National Guard C-130s. The Connecticut Air Guard just returned from Afghanistan. They did eye-watering work in terms of just the tonnage and personnel that they transported in that part of the world. They're doing a good job. And but another issue that we've had to kind of wrestle with on the subcommittee over the last 3 or 4 years is modernization of the C-130s. The propeller issue in particular, the Air Force had to ground obviously some C-130s back in 2019. The Navy had a catastrophe because of defective propellers. a lot of us think that the MP2000 is a solution that just will, eliminate the safety issue that we know, certainly had that impact with the Navy situation. Maybe just talk about that a little bit in terms of, another decision that the subcommittee is going to have to wrestle with very soon.
No, thanks, sir. And I echo your comments on the Guard. We couldn't fight without the Guard. So on the propeller, so we have replaced all the pre-1971 C-130H propellers with the MP2000, which I've been down to the depot. It's a great propeller. We've modified our depot and our maintenance procedures on the post-1971s to mitigate safety concerns. So we're not looking through the safety lens. I will tell you, though, we're in ongoing discussions on how, if there's more money, we could actually take that new propeller and make it more broad across the fleet. So, again, thanks to your constituents who produced a great product.
Well, again, we'll look forward to continuing that conversation. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. General Goldfein, thank you for your service and your engagement with this committee. It's been very helpful, particularly for us younger members. I was wondering, in 2018, we authorized via the NDA then a series of studies on the Air Force's future aircraft inventory. One of those was conducted by CSBA, and we now have that report, a new CSBA report, coming out of that requirement that found that, quote, the current CAF predominantly consists of aging, non-stealth aircraft that are not suitable for operations in contested and highly contested threat environments. This force structure is largely the result of decisions to cancel or prematurely truncate CAF modernization initiatives to develop and procure new weapon systems for high-end operations against modern IADs, such as the F-22 and B-2 programs. In addition to program cost, the primary justification for these decisions was based on a belief that low observable aircraft would not be needed in significant numbers to support contingency operations against regional aggressors like Iraq or North Korea. Although reasonable in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, this assumption is no longer valid. I know that's a mouthful, but do you agree with that CSBA assessment?
Sir, I would say that here's my recollection, having been, and many of in this room perhaps were there when the decision was made to cancel and stop the F-22. At that time, the decision was made to reflow that money into accelerating the F-35. If we had just completed the program of record when that decision was made, we would have 1,000 F-35As on the ramp today. We didn't get there. So therefore, what we have is a fleet that has continued to age out as we've flown it downrange. But I would not align with any assessment that says that low observability is not critical for the future.
Well, what lessons would you then draw or suggest to future planners who may be tempted to cut modernization?
For sure, for the Air Force, I mean, we're probably one of your more technical of services. So again, when you look into, and we can bring, and I'd love to sit down with each of you in the classified setting, when we bring you what we're investing in terms of modernization and the game-changing technology that we're bringing forward, you'll see and understand why we're making the trades we are with some of the older legacy platforms. An Air Force that doesn't modernize doesn't win.
What do you say to those? I mean, you look at the geography of Indo-PACOM, which I think we would all agree is now the priority theater if you follow the logic of the National Defense Strategy. The geography is challenging. The ranges are long. There's questions about the A2AD environment. There's questions about access to allied airfields as well. What do you say to those who would suggest we should, given that geography, be emphasizing our B-21 program, for example, and seek to grow it, perhaps also correspondingly pull back on tactical aircraft procurement?
Sir, I jokingly tell my slide builders that if I see one more slide with a big red dome over China, I'm going to execute choke con on the slide builder. China can't put a block of wood red dome over itself. It can put a block of Swiss cheese. And my job is to know where the hole's in and get in and hold targets at risk at the time and place of the commander-in-chief's choosing. And one of the weapon systems that does that is the B-21.
Point being that, A2AD poses challenges, but it's not an impenetrable wall.
Never.
The Air Force has committed to standoff hypersonic weapons, but what are our plans for stand-in hypersonic weapons associated with the F-35A?
So you may know that we down-selected from 2 hypersonic programs to 1.
This was Arrow and
Axel.
yeah.
And we did that based on the fact that a combination of funding. We had gotten a lot of benefit out of the competition while it went on. The more flexible of the 2 was the Arrow program. So now we're pushing full forward on that. But I'll tell you that the service secretaries signed an agreement to ensure that we take the best of each service when it comes to hypersonic technology, under the leadership, quite frankly, of Dr. Mike Griffin, who's really steeped in this technologically, to make sure that the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marine Corps, that we're all bringing our best technology in our labs forward and making this complementary as we go forward.
Appreciate that. I am running out of time, so General Raymond, all of my detailed questions about the future of Space Force uniforms will have to wait until the next hearing.
I'll be happy to come by and see you too.
Appreciate that very much. I yield.
Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Madam Secretary and generals for being here. General Goldfein, I want to thank you for your service. Had the privilege of receiving testimony from you in this hearing, being in the presence of your presence at a variety of forums, and you're not only a fantastic leader, but a real thought leader. And I hope that as you take off your uniform, you don't venture too far from the national security conversation that's happening in this country. I'm also very excited that your successor, who's been nominated by the President, I'm confident will be confirmed by the Senate, General Charles Brown, the first African-American Chief of Staff, not only for the Air Force, but of any service component. So I'm looking forward to working with him as we ensure that the United States has the air power necessary to counter our adversaries. I wanted to talk about the shortfall in the number of pilots that impacts readiness, but take a more narrow approach. In your joint statement, you say that diverse, resilient, and ready airmen and space professionals are the bedrock of the department's readiness and lethality. You've got a pilot shortfall, and you've got a problem. You're lacking diversity and inclusion among your aviators. In April 3rd of 1939, this Congress created and funded the program that today we know as the Tuskegee Airmen. There were 1,000 pilots in that program. Granted, the corps of pilots was much larger as we were gearing up for World War II, but it represented 0.5%, small percentage of the pilots. Today, there are only 47 African Americans who fly fixed wing in the Air Force. That's 1.5%. And I don't have the numbers for women, but it's as disturbingly low. I know that you're doing a number of things to address that. But the question is, what can we do 81 years later as a Congress to enable you to achieve the diversity, not just for the sake of the diversity, but to enable you and our nation to meet the readiness needs and the challenges that are faced by a shortfall in the pilots that we have in uniform? Can you please address that for me?
Well, as a pilot and someone who worked ardently to get the 1948 law that prohibited women from flying fighters, to get that law changed in 1992 and the policies changed in 1993, it is a topic that matters a great deal to me. And as the secretary who recommended C.Q. Brown's appointment, I feel strongly that we need to occupy the talent in whatever package that talent is presented. I've been a friend of a number of Tuskegee Airmen over the decades and decades, and was there when the president pinned on the general star on now General McGee, a Tuskegee Airman who celebrated his 100th birthday not so long ago. The first thing we have to do is recognize there's a problem, and the quantification of that problem is what the RAND report recently identified for us. And then I think one of the things that will help us is the recent attention brought to military service of when the Space Force was stood up. There's a new excitement about being a part of the military service. People want to be a part of the Air Force and Space Force as a result of that. I would invite my colleagues both to speak to it as well, or I welcome meeting with you further.
I'll take that for the record, because let me just point out that this is what the report found, and we cannot be afraid of this. We have to take it head on. It says that minorities and women, the report found that barriers to minorities and women included racist and sexist comments from simulation instructors, race and gender stereotyping, and a contending with the prevalent culture. This was based on focus groups from not only students, but instructors and leaders. We've got a culture problem in the Air Force, and I expressed this last week in the Navy. So I just implore you to take this on and ask Congress for your help. And in the last 20 seconds I have, let me make a pitch for this. I visited Dover Air Force Base. They're right next door to Delaware State University, an historically black college and university. They have an aviation program there. Their ROTC affiliation, unfortunately, is an hour drive away from Delaware State. Let's find flexibility to establish an ROTC unit right there at Delaware State University so they can team up with Dover and help address this need. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.